When I talk about what is happening to Canadian agriculture under the shadow of Trump era pressure, I am not simply recounting a trade dispute between two neighbors. I am describing a textbook example of how modern capitalism organizes power, dependence, and vulnerability. Let me begin by stating the problem as clearly as I can. Canada, like many so called middle powers around the world, has built an economic model deeply intertwined with the United States. Its farmers send grain, cattle, pork, oil seeds, and processed food across the border into what has long been treated as a predictable, almost taken for granted market. For decades, policymakers reassured themselves that formal trade agreements, dense cross border supply chains, and shared institutions would guarantee stability. Then a figure like Donald Trump arrives in Washington and demonstrates in a very brutal and public way that the larger partner in an asymmetric relationship can weaponize that dependence whenever it chooses. Suddenly, tariffs, threats, tweets, and renegotiated deals like the USMCA reveal that what was presented as a neutral rules based order is in practice an order in which size, leverage, and political theater can be used to discipline smaller partners. Canadian agriculture finds itself caught in the crosshairs of this power game, not because Canadian farmers did anything wrong, but because their economic lives are anchored in a system that gives disproportionate power to one government, one market, one political cycle to determine their fate. From my perspective as an economist who has spent a lifetime analyzing capitalism's structures, what interests me here is not only Trump's bombast or this or that tariff list. What interests me is how a figure like Mark Carney responds to this situation. Carney, with his background as a central banker and global financial insider, comes to Davos and essentially tells the assembled elites middle powers like Canada do not have to accept a crude binary between submission and isolation. He is not proposing to confront Washington directly with military or economic threats, nor is he suggesting that Canada withdraw into protectionist self sufficiency. Instead, he is articulating a third option: organize, coordinate, and build coalitions among similarly placed economies, countries like Japan, the European Union states, Australia, South Korea, that share certain structural features. They are wealthy, integrated into global markets, but individually too small to dictate terms to the United States or China. What Carney is saying, in effect, is that these states can act together in ways that change the bargaining landscape. They do not become superpowers by alliance, but they can make it more costly for a larger player to bully them one by one. He frames this as an intelligent strategy for the 21st century, where sovereignty is no longer about standing alone and shouting the loudest, but about standing together with clear, coordinated intent. Now, how exactly is this supposed to work for Canadian agriculture? Let us remember that Trump's approach to trade was often framed as America first, but the concrete method was very old fashioned: bilateral pressure. You corner one country at a time. Mexico, Canada, China, the EU threaten tariffs, demand concessions, and use the sheer size of the U.S. market as the club. When your neighbor knows that a huge percentage of its exports go to your consumers, you can credibly threaten to restrict access and force them to accept terms that they would never accept in a genuinely symmetric negotiation. Canadian farmers understood this intuitively long before the pundits did. When the White House started throwing around the possibility of tariffs on steel, aluminum, autos, and even retaliatory measures on agricultural products, Farmers and ranchers in places like Saskatchewan, Alberta, and Ontario knew that their livelihoods were being used as bargaining chips. That is what it means concretely to live inside an asymmetric economic relationship. Another government's negotiating tactic shows up as anxiety on your farm, as uncertainty about whether the grain you are planting this spring will have a buyer next year. Carney's strategy tries to neutralize that kind of pressure, not through rhetoric, but through structure. He looks at the existing and emerging trade architecture, agreements like the Comprehensive and Progressive Agreement for Trans-Pacific Partnership, the Canada-EU Trade Agreement, and other regional frameworks, and sees in them more than just incremental market access. He sees the possibility of building alternative corridors for Canadian exports, particularly in sectors like agriculture that have been so heavily pointed southward for generations. If Canada can reliably send beef to Japan, pork to South Korea, wheat to Vietnam, and value-added food products into European supermarkets under stable, high-standard trade rules, then Washington's capacity to terrify Canadian producers with the mere threat of border disruption is weakened. The logic here is simple, almost banal, but very real. If you are less dependent on a single buyer, that buyers' threats lose some of their force. Diversification becomes, in his language, a form of insurance. It is not romantic, it is not revolutionary, but it is a way of slightly changing where power lies in the system. But Carney goes further than diversification. He insists that in the current phase of capitalism, trade is about standards as much as it is about tariffs. This is crucial. For many people, trade disputes are imagined in terms of headline tariff rates, 10% here, 25% there. In practice, much of the real power lies in who gets to define the rules under which goods move at all: food safety regulations, environmental and carbon standards, animal welfare rules, digital traceability systems that track a shipment of canola or beef from farm to table. When a bloc of countries coordinates these standards and locks them into trade agreements, they are doing more than smoothing commerce. They are effectively deciding who can participate in certain lucrative markets. Carney's vision for a coalition of middle powers is precisely about this. If Canada, the EU, Japan, South Korea, and others converge on rigorous, climate-conscious, transparent standards, they collectively become a standard-setting bloc. They define what counts as acceptable agricultural production for perhaps hundreds of millions of affluent consumers. Now, bring Trump back into the picture. If the United States, under his leadership, chooses to pursue deregulation, to roll back environmental protections, to treat climate policy as a hoax, it risks diverging from these aligned standards. In a purely bilateral world, that divergence is easily imposed on smaller neighbors. The bigger partner says, "We do it this way now, adjust or lose access." But in a world where there is a coordinated group of middle powers locking in higher standards, the cost of divergence becomes higher for Washington. Either it aligns with those rules to reach those consumers, or it tries to go its own way and finds that its producers may face hurdles entering markets that now demand sustainability, traceability, and specific safety regimes. From Carney's standpoint, this is a technocratic way to discipline the behavior of a superpower, not by matching its raw size, but by helping to shape the rulebook that global capital must actually obey if it wants to reach key markets. For Canadian agriculture, that means potentially turning adherence to higher standards from a cost into a competitive asset. I want to be honest here. This is a clever move within the existing system, but it remains within that system. It does not overturn capitalism's hierarchy. It tries to rearrange some of the leverage points within it. Nonetheless, for a Canadian farmer, that can be the difference between being permanently exposed to the latest mood in Washington and having at least some protection via broader alliances. When Carney speaks of neutralizing pressure, what he has in mind is something like this. Imagine a future in which, during the next wave of U.S. protectionism, Ottawa can quietly signal to Washington that any arbitrary agricultural tariffs will not just upset Canada, but will trigger coordinated responses across a much wider network, responses in financial markets, investment regimes, regulatory cooperation, and reciprocal market access for U.S. products. Suddenly, the White House is not bullying one mid-sized neighbor. It is poking a web of interdependent economies that together represent a substantial share of global demand and capital. The calculus of pressure changes. The threat of "we will close our market to your farmers" runs into the counter threat of "fine, but you may find your own firms locked out of multiple jurisdictions that have agreed to stand together." To really understand what is at stake for Canadian agriculture, we must connect this high-level strategy to the day-to-day economic realities in rural Canada. When a Saskatchewan grain farmer chooses which crops to plant, when a Quebec dairy cooperative invests in new processing equipment, when an Alberta cattle operation expands its herd, they are making bets on future prices, future demand, and future market access. Those bets are already risky because agriculture is at the mercy of weather, pests, global commodity cycles, and volatile input costs like fuel and fertilizer. Add to that a layer of political risk, uncertainty about whether a single dominant export market will remain open, and you magnify the insecurity. Trump did not create that insecurity, he exposed it. He made visible the fact that Canadian agriculture was structurally dependent on decisions made in a capital it did not control. What Carney is trying to do is create a system in which that political risk is spread out so that the pain of one country's erratic trade policy can be cushioned by stable access elsewhere. There is also a financial dimension to all of this that aligns with Carney's background. Agriculture today is capital intensive. Precision farming technologies, irrigation systems, storage infrastructure, climate resilient seeds, and digital logistics all require long-term investment. Investors, whether they are banks, pension funds, or cooperative credit unions, look for predictable revenue streams, not markets that can be shut down by a presidential tweet. If Canada can credibly demonstrate that its agricultural sector is embedded in a diversified, rule-based network of trade relationships that does not rise and fall solely with U.S. electoral cycles, then the perceived risk goes down and the willingness to finance modernization goes up. In straightforward economic terms, this lowers the cost of capital for Canadian agriculture, which can in turn support productivity, adaptation to climate change, and value-added processing at home instead of simply exporting raw commodities. Once again, we are not out of capitalism here. We are watching one of its managers attempt to stabilize a volatile sector by rearranging its international scaffolding. At Davos, when elites discuss these strategies, they wrap them in lofty language about resilience, rules-based multilateralism, and shared prosperity. I want you to strip away that rhetoric and see the core logic. Middle powers like Canada are trapped in a global system where 2 or 3 giants dominate: the United States, China, the European Union. They cannot outgun or outspend these giants, so they seek safety in numbers. By banding together, they try to ensure that no single hegemon can casually impose its will on them without facing resistance that is costly enough to deter the worst abuses. For Canadian agriculture, that translates into a modest but real reduction in vulnerability to raw U.S. power, instead of simply hoping that the next occupant of the White House will be kinder. Carney wants to embed Canadian farms into a multipolar network of trade relationships and regulatory alignments that blunt some of that arbitrary influence. It is a strategy of alliance rather than confrontation. However, as a Marxian economist, I must emphasize what this does not do. It does not give Canadian farmers democratic control over the global value chains in which they sit. It does not question the concentration of corporate power in agribusiness, in grain trading, in food processing, or in the big retailers that dominate the shelves where Canadian and foreign consumers buy their food. It does not change the basic fact that farmers often capture a shrinking share of the value created along the chain from field to fork. Instead, Carney's proposal operates within that hierarchy, trying to tilt some of the interstate bargaining power back toward middle powers, including Canada, so that they can manage their own capitalist classes and their own working populations with slightly more room for maneuver. In other words, it is a strategy designed to make the existing system more stable and less vulnerable to the whims of a single national government, not to transform the system that generates these vulnerabilities in the first place. For the moment, though, let us stay with the historical context. The rise of Trump did not occur in a vacuum. It was the culmination of decades of growing discontent in the United States with globalization, deindustrialization, and the hollowing out of certain regions. The U.S. political class sold trade deals like NAFTA as win-win arrangements, but large swaths of the American working class experienced them as mechanisms that facilitated outsourcing, wage stagnation, and job loss. In that environment, a politician promising to renegotiate bad deals and bring jobs back could mobilize a great deal of anger. Trump's trade policy was incoherent in many ways, but it had a consistent core. Use America's market size as leverage to rewrite relationships in a way that he could present as more favorable to domestic constituencies, regardless of the actual long-term consequences. For countries like Canada, which had for decades oriented their economic model around open access to that U.S. market, this was a rude awakening. Historically, middle powers have tried various strategies to cope with dominant neighbors or empires. They have sought imperial preference within an empire, as Canada once did within the British Empire. They have tried non-alignment, attempting to avoid entanglement in great power rivalries. They have embraced regionalism, hoping that building strong ties with neighbors would give them collective strength in a world of giants. Carney's Davos articulation of a middle power alliance strategy is a contemporary version of that last option, updated for a world in which global value chains, financial markets, and regulatory regimes play a much larger role than simple tariff schedules. Instead of imperial preference, we have coordinated standards. Instead of geographic blocks defined by colonial ties, we have networks of advanced economies that share similar regulatory capacities and political interests. The continuity is that middle powers are still searching for ways to avoid being crushed or marginalized when giants fight or flex their muscles. So when we speak of Davos defiance in this context, it is a subdued, technocratic defiance, not the defiance of mass movements or radical ruptures. There are no fiery speeches promising to tear up the system. There are careful speeches proposing to fine-tune it so that the shocks from the center are less destructive at the periphery. In that sense, Carney is offering a survival strategy for Canada's agricultural sector under capitalism's current configuration. He is saying to Canadian farmers, you do not have to be as exposed to the moods of Washington as you were in the past. We can build alternative pathways. We can forge alliances with other countries in similar situations. We can use institutions like trade agreements and central banks to hedge against the volatility that Trumpism represents. It is a promise of stability through networking rather than through structural change. In part one of this broader discussion, then, what I have tried to do is lay out the basic contours of the problem and the proposed response. The problem is an asymmetric capitalist world economy in which a middle power like Canada and sectors like Canadian agriculture are structurally dependent on a larger neighbor whose political leadership can and does instrumentalize that dependence. The exposure of that condition under Trump made it impossible to ignore. The response, as articulated by someone like Mark Carney at Davos, is not to challenge capitalism as such, but to reconfigure alliances within it, to build coalitions of middle powers, to coordinate standards, to diversify markets, and thereby to neutralize, or at least dilute, the unilateral pressure that Washington can bring to bear. As we move forward, we will need to examine more closely the systemic implications of this approach, its limits, and the deeper questions it raises about who benefits and who remains vulnerable in this world of carefully managed interdependence.